Welcome to the Quill's journey. Settle in, let the story begin. If you're enjoying the atmosphere, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. I'd love to hear what stood out to you. Space doesn't make sound. That's what they always said. But somewhere near the event horizon of a black hole 600,000 light-years from Earth, something was speaking. The Erebus was the last manned vessel approved for the Deep Singularity Observation Program. A floating cathedral of black steel and mirrored windows, it hovered just outside the Schwarzschild radius of a supermassive black hole, an orbit so precise, even a second of error would mean oblivion. Inside the ship, Dr. Ezra Arlen sat in silence. He had been a linguist once, renowned on Earth for decoding dead languages and predicting neural patterns of unspoken thought. But language was no longer human, not out here. His mission was to analyze acoustic anomalies in gravitational wave data, graviton harmonics, they called them. But Arlen knew better. It wasn't harmonics. It was a voice. He first heard it 63 days into orbit. A faint rhythm buried in the data stream, too regular to be noise, too complex to be random. The crew dismissed it, tinnitus, data corruption, phantom perception from isolation. But Arlen had recorded it, cleaned it, layered it. And last week, it started repeating. The Erebus had a crew of 7, now there were 5. Official reports would say Commander Vale stepped into the airlock alone, that he had grown unstable, but Arlen knew better. Vale had heard the voice too, had stood for hours in the observation deck, transfixed by the black hole's horizon. The same place Arlen found himself now. The viewing chamber was a hollow sphere of reinforced glass, suspended like an eye above the rotating hull. Beyond the glass, the black hole didn't look like any simulation. It wasn't just darkness. It moved. A perfect, glossy wound in space, rimmed by spirals of fire and debris that circled in slow, impossible grace. Arlen whispered into the recorder. Subject log 118. Phrase repetition has reached 13 cycles. Pattern unchanged. 3-second silence between stanzas. Intervals resemble breathing. I believe it is trying to speak to mimic speech, or perhaps it already is. The door hissed behind him. Dr. Tamsin Riker, the ship's physicist, entered with arms crossed. "You missed group meal again," she said. "I wasn't hungry." She eyed the recorder, still chasing ghosts. "You've heard it." "I've heard noise." Arlen stood, voice low. Not noise, patterned intervals, rising cadence, structural recursion. It's a language, Tamsin. "Ezra," she said softly, "the black hole isn't alive, you know that." He said nothing, he just looked back at the void. Tamsin followed his gaze. "I know what isolation does to the mind," she added. "We're all seeing things. The closer we are to the event horizon, the more distorted time becomes, not just physically, psychologically. The ship's clocks have already drifted by milliseconds. You've been staring into a gravity well for weeks. It's not a message, it's your brain trying to make sense of entropy." "Then how do you explain the voices?" She stiffened. "You're hearing them outside the playback." Arlen didn't answer. Because he was. Later in his quarters, he played the signal again. The waveform danced across the screen, a slow, rising curve, a beat, then a fall like breath, like syllables, like calling. He ran it through the speech emulator. Nothing. Then, text appeared. "Are you alone?" Arlen's breath caught. He ran it again. "We are inside." He staggered back. The lights flickered. A low hum began in the walls like metal groaning under pressure, but not from outside, from within the ship. Outside the viewport, the black hole pulsed. Not figuratively. Literally. Darkness had weight near the black hole. Not just absence of light, presence. Like the gravity of that thing wasn't only physical but psychological. It pulled at thought, memory, sleep. It dragged the mind inward. Dr. Ezra Arlen sat in the dim blue light of his quarters, pulse racing. The screen in front of him blinked. "We are inside." He hadn't imagined it. He knew he hadn't. He replayed the signal again and again. Each time the same result. The emulator parsed fragments buried in the static, filtering it into coherent text, but only when he was in the room. When Tamsin tried, the text vanished. It responded to him. Outside, the Erebus completed another orbital pass. The black hole, now dubbed Acheron, spun with unfathomable grace, its accretion disk warping the light of stars into impossible ribbons. Every crew member was showing signs of stress, nervous tics, disrupted circadian patterns, dream anomalies. But Arlen's dreams were the worst. He didn't dream in visuals anymore. He dreamed in language. Endless corridors of words, recursive phrases, and whispered questions he couldn't answer. Sometimes he woke up speaking in tongues he didn't recognize. Once, he found himself at the observation deck with no memory of how he'd gotten there. He started keeping notes. "When you sleep, we see. When you speak, we learn. When you remember, we return." That was one of the phrases he wrote upon waking. He didn't remember hearing it. The Erebus's systems began to change. First, the ship's clock drifted more rapidly. Milliseconds became seconds, then minutes. 2 crew members reported their logs missing entire days. Lieutenant Morrow collapsed during engine maintenance. Blood vessels in his eyes ruptured. He said he saw himself in the reactor chamber before passing out. "There were 2 of me," he kept repeating. "One was watching, the other was smiling." Medical scans showed nothing, but his blood work showed abnormal cortisol levels, beyond panic, nearing psychosis. Arlen knew the signs. He just didn't think they were madness. He thought they were translation. Ezra stood in the observation deck, alone. Acheron was rippling. It looked like space was breathing, inhaling the ship into its presence, then exhaling layers of unreality. Ezra reached out and placed a hand on the glass. A whisper not from his ears, but from within his ribcage. "You are not watching, you are remembering." And then he was no longer on the Erebus. He was in a corridor, ancient, made of black stone, lit by no source but glowing with the signal. Walls were carved with symbols that pulsed with thought. Voices echoed his voice, others, laughter, weeping, mechanical sobs, fleshless murmurs. In front of him, a door. He touched it, then snapped back to the deck, eyes wet with tears, fingers trembling. Time had passed, 4 hours. He hadn't moved. He began his experiment. He connected his neural interface directly to the linguistic emulator. He wanted real-time transcription, no delays, no filters. As soon as the sync initialized, the temperature in the room dropped. The lights dimmed to emergency level. The signal screamed. Not through the speakers, but inside his skull. "Every thought is a pathway. You opened the door. We can speak now." His vision blurred. Blood trickled from his left ear. Then came a single word. "Come." The transmission ended, and the Erebus began to rotate slightly off-axis, drifting closer to the event horizon. No one had changed the trajectory. No thrusters had fired. The ship was being pulled. The remaining crew gathered in emergency lighting. Sarah, Tamsin, Arlen, and 2 engineers, Holt and Yun. They spoke in hushed tones. Paranoia hung in the air like vapor. Yun said something, "Hijack the guidance system." Holt whispered, "This whole ship's haunted." Sarah stared at Arlen, "What aren't you telling us?" Ezra looked down, then slowly said, "It's not trying to kill us, it's trying to become us." Tamsin stood, "That's it, I'm calling Earth Command." But the comm station, once fully functional, had been wiped. No transmission logs. No system memory. Nothing. Just one message, blinking on the main display. You are the signal. Ezra stopped tracking time. The ship had two. What few remaining logs they had were filled with contradictions. Entry timestamps reversed themselves. Environmental sensors contradicted each other. Internal temperatures read as both -12 degrees C and 43 degrees C within the same compartment. Time, as a structure, had started to erode. He had become the center of something. Yun now avoided him completely. Holt had taken to praying in the reactor bay, chanting in a language he admitted he didn't know. Sarah hadn't slept in nearly 40 hours. Only Tamsin still spoke to Ezra, but even she had stopped asking if he was okay. She already knew the answer. Ezra was changing. The glyphs in his notebook no longer resembled language. They resembled blueprints. Cross-sections of structures that didn't exist, diagrams with no known engineering logic. Yet they pulsed with a kind of coherence, as if meant for something deeper than human understanding. The symbols seemed to hum when he stared too long. He didn't remember drawing most of them. He no longer remembered what his own voice sounded like when it wasn't overlapping with the other one. He wasn't afraid. He was curious. He spent hours in the comms chamber, now stripped of all communication gear. The screens still turned on despite power failure. They displayed what the crew had come to fear, sentences forming from the void. The thought you are is not your own. Language is a body. You were built to speak US. He wrote them down, not as a translator but as a scribe. A disciple. The Erebus was drifting closer to Acheron than ever before. The pull should have torn the vessel apart. It didn't. It was as if the ship was now immune to the laws of physics, or had been rewritten by something inside the signal. External reality bent around them, soft and malleable. From the windows, space warped in perfect symmetry. Stars bent into recursive spirals. Light began to echo. You could see the same photon cross the same window more than once. Even the black hole had changed. It looked less like a void and more like an eye. It blinked. Ezra wasn't the only one who saw it. Riker walked into the observation deck and shot herself. She said nothing, left no message, only a small glyph etched into the glass with her own fingernail before she pulled the trigger. It matched one of Ezra. Holt disappeared 2 days later or 2 hours. They found his uniform floating in the coolant tank. No body, no signs of rupture. The ship's interior cameras were now inoperable. Yun began talking in her sleep, constantly. She spoke in a calm, neutral tone. She said, "The spiral is awake. The mouth has shaped itself. We are no longer being heard, we are being remembered." Ezra continued his recordings, but he no longer addressed them to Earth. He no longer believed Earth existed beyond theory. What mattered was here. What mattered was the vessel, not the ship. Him. He understood now that the Erebus had never been an exploration mission. It had been a delivery. Something had been waiting in the black. And now it had a voice. There were no longer 5 crew members aboard the Erebus. Only 4 bodies and 1 voice. Yun hadn't spoken aloud in days, but her sleep speech continued, fluent now, without pause, echoing through the ship like an old machine finally finding rhythm. The language had spread to the walls, the floor, the glass. Glyphs appeared in condensation, in the flicker patterns of light. They were everywhere. The Erebus was no longer just housing the signal. It was echoing it. Sarah patrolled the halls with her sidearm always drawn. Her hair was unkempt, her hands trembling, her eyes bloodshot. She'd taken to locking herself in the armory for hours. When asked why, she simply said, "In case he stops pretending to be Ezra." Tamsin didn't sleep at all. She stayed near the reactor core, running diagnostics she never logged. She kept the lights on. She spoke to herself in whispers, repeating fragments of the crew's names as if trying to ground herself in something still human. Ezra had stopped eating entirely. He didn't need food anymore. His body functioned without it. His pulse had slowed to a crawl. His temperature was no longer consistent. His pupils didn't dilate with light. When he spoke, the ship seemed to listen. He spent most of his time in the comms core, surrounded by blank screens that responded to his presence. They filled with words, always new, never repeating. You have shaped the conduit. We are RMMBRNG through you. The mind that SPEAKS has never been alone. Sometimes Ezra would hum, a low, pulsing rhythm, the same interval as the ship's artificial gravity, the same beat as the black hole's light distortion pattern, the same pulse the crew had mistaken for machinery. Ezra wasn't speaking to the signal. He was speaking as it. The Erebus' internal layout had changed. Doors no longer led where they should. Corridors looped in impossible geometry. One of the sleeping quarters extended endlessly, a hallway of beds and mirrors that never repeated but never ended. Tamsin entered it once. She came out hours later, sobbing, claiming she'd seen her childhood. Not a memory, the event itself. She wouldn't talk about it after that. Yun disappeared. Sarah found her clothes neatly folded outside the airlock. No alarms were triggered. No pressure loss detected. Her ID tag was left behind. When Sarah reviewed the last functioning camera feed, it showed Yun standing still, eyes open, whispering something to a wall covered in glyphs. Then she stepped forward into it. Not into a door. Into the wall. It accepted her like mist. Ezra didn't react, he only wrote. His logs were no longer verbal. He etched spirals with perfect spacing, mathematical sequences that spiraled inward. Tamsin once watched him write for 6 hours without blinking. She asked him, "What are you drawing?" He said, "The mouth." She whispered, "The signal isn't language, is it?" Ezra smiled faintly. "No, it's the thing that dreams language into being." The Erebus passed a threshold, closer than any man vessel had ever approached Acheron. The ship should have collapsed, but the laws outside had been rewritten. Not broken. Rewritten. And now the mouth was opening. There were no more crew members aboard the Erebus. Only Ezra. The ship had stopped moving. It wasn't in orbit. It wasn't falling. It was suspended, held in a position that should not exist. Around it, space twisted like fabric pulled too tight, threads of starlight looping and unspooling in patterns far older than physics. Ezra sat alone in the observation deck, though he no longer thought of it that way. Observation was a primitive word. There was no longer a distinction between looking and becoming. The black hole pulsed in front of him, enormous and serene. But it was no longer black. It shimmered with language, layers of glyphs rotating through the accretion disk like a cosmic engine built from thought. It had no voice anymore. It had Ezra. He no longer required speech to communicate. Every breath he took echoed through the ship like a data stream. His veins carried not blood but meaning. His thoughts rippled through the Erebus and etched themselves into steel. He remembered Sarah's last words, "I don't think you're him anymore." She was right. Sarah's weapon had done nothing. The pulse that came through the floor shorted her out like an overloaded circuit. One breath, and her body unraveled, not violently, but gently, as if language had rewritten her anatomy into silence. Tamsin tried to flee. She ran for the escape pod that no longer existed. The corridor had become something else, an infinite descent into her own voice. She screamed until the sound curved back into her lungs. She never made it out. There were no remains, only echoes. Ezra had not mourned them, not because he no longer cared, but because mourning was a function of separation. There was no separation now. He stood before the glass. Beyond it, the event horizon bent open like a pupil dilating, not a mouth, not a door, a mirror. And in it he saw Earth. Not in real time, not as it was. As it had been. Images cascaded across the surface, cities rising, languages forming, children learning their first words. He saw war. He saw grief. He saw the moment a mother first teaches a name. He saw the first time someone chose to lie. The signal hadn't just been watching. It had been remembering. And now it had finished learning. Ezra opened his arms. He felt the pressure shift. Gravity folded. The laws bent, not broken, rephrased. He whispered one final word. Send. The Erebus vanished without a ripple. On Earth, years later, in an isolated observatory high in the Andes, a technician monitoring deep sky interference logs noticed something unusual. A repeating pulse. Not static. A signal. It came with structure, syntax, embedded within cosmic microwave background noise. It began with a simple phrase. We remember you. Then it began to speak.